welcome to this spotlight episode on the Earl of Airlie, a quick look at lesser-known locomotives from the early days of steam. The Earl of Airlie and its sister locomotive, the Lord Wharncliffe, were the first conventional-ish British locomotives to use bogies. They were two of the earliest locomotives to be built in Scotland, the first locomotive to operate in Scotland being a six-wheeled locomotive built by that Sassenach, George Stephenson, for the Kilmarnock and Troon Railway in 1819. The Earl of Airlie was built at the foundry of James and Charles Carmichael in Dundee for the 4-foot 6-inch gauge Dundee and Newtyle Railway. She and her sister locomotive were delivered in September and October 1833 at a cost of £700 each. The tenders cost an additional £30. Despite being 3 years younger than Robert Stephenson's Planet, which utilised horizontal cylinders, and indeed examples of which were already running in Scotland, this pair of locomotives were delivered with vertical cylinders. Clearly James Watt's dire predictions about the weight of a piston in a horizontal cylinder rapidly wearing it out took a long time to cast off. The cylinders were mounted at either side of the boiler and measured 11 by 18 inches. The piston rod was guided by a crosshead and slide bars, and a drive to the 4 feet 8 inch diameter driving wheels was via a bell crank and outside connecting rods. The slide valves were worked by Carmichael's own valve gear, and this used two fixed eccentrics, one per valve, and an X-galg, which could be raised or lowered from pins and a rocking shaft, which provided fore and back gear. The boiler was conventional and clearly influenced by Stephenson's Planet. It was multi-tubular, with a smoke box at one end and a firebox within the boiler barrel at the other. There were two spring-loaded safety valves mounted on the firebox, and boiler pressure was 50 psi, the Stephenson norm. There was an external steam manifold and an external regulator, and the main steam pipes were also outside. Perhaps the most revolutionary part of the design was the four-wheel bogie at the firebox end of the locomotive. The bogie had been in use in South Wales since the late 18th century, and was patented by two English Quakers in 1812. And indeed, Robert Stephenson and Company began building locomotives fitted with four-wheel leading bogies for American customers in 1833, the same year that the Earl of Airlie was delivered. A third bogie locomotive for the Dundee and Newtyle Railway was built by the Dundee Foundry Company. The Dundee Foundry Company was owned and managed by James Stirling and his brother, the Reverend Dr. Robert Stirling, and the pair had taken out patents for hot air or caloric engines in 1816 and 1825. The Reverend Dr. Robert Stirling, of course, was the father of the great locomotive engineer Patrick Stirling, who would rise to prominence as locomotive superintendent of the Great Northern Railway. Known as the Trotter, she was an unusual 420, and she clearly shared some design features from the Manchester, built for the Liverpool and Manchester Railway by Bowman, Galloway and Glasgow of Manchester. The pair of vertical cylinders were mounted at the front end of the locomotive, driving a crankshaft. Outside cranks and long connecting rods drove the 4 feet 8 inch diameter driving wheels placed in front of the firebox. The boiler was multi-tubular, but like the Manchester, the hot gases were ducted back towards the firebox before exiting the chimney at the firebox end. So too the exhaust steam from the cylinders. The weight of the boiler was carried on a four-wheel articulated bogie. Trotter was delivered in March 1834 during the apprenticeship of Archibald Sturrock, who would be Patrick Stirling's predecessor on the Great Northern Railway. The Trotter was involved in a fatal accident in June 1834 when she derailed, and a man who had been travelling illegally on the tender was crushed to death by the locomotive. Subsequently, Archibald Sturrock helped with a major rebuild of the Trotter in 1836. Trotter was a freakish one-off, as the next locomotive designed by James Stirling were three outside cylinder 222 patentee types ordered in 1834 for the Arbroath and Forfar Railway. The Dundee and Newtyle Railway was converted to British standard gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches in 1847. The Earl of Airlie was then sidelined and was used as a water pump until about 1850, Then, in 1854, Alexander Allan, the locomotive superintendent of the Scottish Central Railway, retrieved the remains of the venerable machine, had it restored and photographed. Thereafter, the fate of the Earl of Airlie is unknown. So that has been a quick look at the Earl of Airlie, the first conventional-ish locomotive in Britain to use a bogie. An idea which quickly caught on in the United States and some parts of Europe, where track standards were less exacting, but, thanks to higher quality permanent way, was much slower to be adopted in Britain. In fact, it would take another 20 years for Archibald Sturrock to produce the first mainline express passenger locomotive with a bogie in Britain. No doubt, of course, influenced by his experiences as a young man with the bogie locomotives for the Dundee Newtyle Railway. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and if you have, please leave a comment below. Please also like, share and subscribe, and if you feel able, you can also support this channel on Patreon at patreon.com/railstory for as little as a take-out cup of coffee once per month. And I look forward to seeing you all next time on Rail Story.